Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Spring Trump in the World lecture series, hosted by the Jackson School of International Studies. My name is Wolf Latch. I'm the Director of Academic Services in the Jackson School. And just a few words about how this talk, lecture, class is going to work. So this series of lectures is open to the public, so anyone can come and attend any one or all of the classes. But it's also a class, so there are students here who are registered for JSIS 478G, Special Topics Global Studies. In order to earn the credit, students have to attend all of the talks. In order to make sure that they indeed do that, all students starting next week will have to sign in before they take their seat. So starting next Tuesday's lecture, outside this door here, we will have staff of my office standing and signing in students, checking them in. And otherwise, anybody else who wants to attend can just attend here without receiving credit. I will be sending out a reminder to anyone who's registered in the class every Tuesday morning what is the topic, but the topic can also be found on the Jackson School website. If you go to the Jackson School main website, one of the tiles is Trump in the World, and you can see what the offerings are and what the talks are going forward. So any students that want to still register can obviously register for the class anytime this week, and will receive 2 credits if we have attendance for them in all lectures. So I'm going to now hand over to Professor Urshad Kasaba, the director of the Jackson School and the moderator of this lecture series.
So thank you, Wolf. Just a 1 point to those of you who have signed up to this as a class. This is a credit, no credit class. And as Wolf mentioned, starting from next week, we will check your names as you enter. You are allowed to miss 1 lecture in the course of these 9 weeks. If you miss more than 1, we will ask you to write a reflection paper on the topic that you missed. So you have to find out about it. And I will also, as we move forward, I will also ask the contributors to suggest some readings, and I will put those on the course Canvas site, so you can have access to those. And some of the lectures will be recorded, and you can access those on the Canvas side as well. So to get credit, you have to attend, and if you miss more than 1, you need to write a reflection paper on all the sections that you have missed. And those of you who are not students, we more than welcome you to attend this. Part of what we are trying to accomplish is to not only to interact with our students, but also to share our knowledge and insights with our community. So this is actually the 3rd time we are hosting this class, this series, Trump in the World. I don't know what you think, but we feel in the Jackson School that we are going through an interesting and important period of transition. There are various ways in which you can think about it, but in a general level, there seems to be a consensus that the world order that was set up at the end of World War II is being really stretched to the limit. And according to the number of articles that are coming up just about every day, that order is ending or has ended, and nobody seems to know really what is coming to replace it. So that's the main concern that caused us to think about a series like this. And we in the Jackson School, of course, I mean, we are famous for being a school that was built on really what we call area studies. So this is in-depth study of different parts of the world and regions And what that means, of course, that a lot of my colleagues and myself spend our time really reading publications, accounts, writings that come from all over the world. And so that gives us an interesting perspective on the world. So that is primarily the organizing principle of these lectures, is really to share our insights that come from knowing about different parts of the world. And that's not the only thing, of course. We are not just interested in these different regions, we're interested in broader processes that bring the world together and what happens to those processes. So the lecture series then combine area-focused, regional-focused presentations with some more thematic presentations. We will start with several lectures on Asia, today Japan, next week Koreas, two Koreas, and the following week Indo-Pacific Strategy Challenges. That will include a discussion of China. Then we will spend 3 weeks on themes, 3 themes that are migration, global energy challenges, and online disinformation. And then we will conclude again with a series of presentations that focus on Europe and Middle East, Israel, European Union, Russia, and some discussion of Kurds in the Middle East, and a general discussion. All the presenters are affiliated with the Jackson School, except for Kate Starboard, who's a professor in human-centered design and engineering, and the issues, the topics that she's interested in on online disinformation, the whole how this online networks work in our world, are very relevant, of course, to all the discussions that we're having today. So I'm very excited about the list, and I'm really looking forward to learning from my colleagues. And I'm really pleased that we are kicking this off with a discussion of primarily Japan by Professor Robert Pekkanen. Robert is a professor in the Jackson School. He's a political scientist by training. He has written, if I'm not miscounting, 10 books and numerous articles. Many of them have won international awards and prizes. One of our most distinguished colleagues. His interest started with a study of Japanese civil society, democratic politics, democratic political parties in Japan, but most recently he is involved in a comparative study of populism in Asia and beyond. He's part of a network of scholars who is working on this topic, and as you can imagine, it is very, very central to a lot of our concerns today. So I am very pleased that Robert is here, and he is starting our series, Trump and the World.
Great, thank you. Good evening. It's great to be here. I actually, thanks to Dean Judy Howard and Professor Casaba, I was on sabbatical last year, so I wasn't able to join this, Trump and the World, and I was really looking forward to joining it this year. And what better way than to talk about some of the subjects that hold the greatest intellectual appeal to me. As Professor Casaba mentioned, I'll talk about Japan. Time permitting, I'd also like to engage us in a discussion of populism. I'm also pleased that today's class is free. Nobody had to sign in. You're not getting credit for it. So we're all here for the same reason, to really think about these issues and to contemplate the world that we're living in today. I do also want to say that a lot is going on. In fact, I hope, Rashad, you won't think this is unfair, but I went back to the date of the email in which you invited me to give this lecture, and then I began to look at what's happened since then. It includes the TPP-11 Regional Free Trade Agreement led by Japan, the announcement of the US putting tariffs on steel and aluminum imports, then the announcement of exemptions to that list, a summit between the US and North Korea was announced. The US also is putting tariffs on Chinese products, or maybe not, we don't know yet. And the Korea-US trade agreement was renegotiated, as my colleague Clark Sorensen reminded me at lunch today. So a lot is going on. Here's what I'd like to talk about today. I'll begin with a very short background on Japanese politics to bring us all up to speed on the contemporary situation in Japan. Then I'm going to emphasize how Trump matters to Japan. Not to get ahead of myself, but the answer is going to be a lot. Trump is a consequential world figure, and Japan is no exception to that. I'll break this down into international relations, broadly speaking about trade, and then, perhaps even more importantly, about security. And then I'll turn to one of my particular areas of interest, Japanese domestic politics. I'll acquaint you to the relationship between President Trump and the Japanese Prime Minister, Shinzo Abe. It involves golf. And then I'll talk about the 2017 election, which was held in October in Japan, in which Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's Liberal Democratic Party won a resounding victory, in part because of international relations, more North Korea, but also due to how Abe portrayed himself as having the ability to manage a relationship with Donald Trump. Then I'll go through some interesting poll results about Japanese public perceptions of the United States in recent years. Finally, and even though this is only one bullet point on this cleverly designed slide, it's actually about 20 slides about populism and American democracy. So I hope we'll have time to get to that. But we won't if we don't start. So with apologies to my colleague, Professor Mark Metzler, a distinguished historian of Japan, I'm going to cover all of Japanese history in one slide. To be fair, I did warn you, Mark. So if you're a student, you will get much more of an understanding of Japanese history if you do take Professor Metzler's class. So this is not sufficient. And here, I won't go through all of this, but point out the highlights. The Meiji Restoration, in which the modern foundations of the modern state of Japan were set up, and then Japan's democratic period, Taisho democracy, which ended with the rise of Japanese militarism at home and Japanese invasion of Manchuria, broader invasion of China, and Pearl Harbor, what Americans think of as World War II, but when Japan can be considered the Pacific War, a broader war. This ended with Japan's defeat in World War II and the US occupation, which set the foundations for contemporary Japan. The twin imperatives of the US occupation were to demilitarize Japan and to democratize Japan. Now keep your eye on that demilitarized part, because that's something that's a part of the contemporary debates, and change of that may have been spurred by the election of President Trump. So if I'm going to be unfair to Japanese history, I should also be unfair to Japanese international relations. So here's your one slide primer on the international relations of Japan. As many of you know, I'm very fond of the professor who teaches international relations of Japan at the University of Washington, so I definitely recommend her class. Article 9. I'll show you the text of Article 9 later, but this is something you may have heard of if you're following the debate about Japan's international relations. It is the clause of Japan's constitution that renounces war as an instrument of statecraft. This is the basis on which Japan's constitution is sometimes characterized as Japan's pacifist constitution or the peace constitution. It was written under the US occupation, referenced earlier. I'll also remind us all that Japan does have one military alliance, which is with the United States. This is an asymmetrical treaty. It was signed under the occupation when Japan did not have sovereignty, but was renewed and revised in 1960 in a tumultuous period, domestic politics of Japan, and it continues to bind our two nations. The United States is obligated to defend Japan militarily. In exchange, Japan provides bases for US troops, and many of you may know that there are large numbers of US troops, primarily in Okinawa, and this is the basis for the US-Japan military alliance. And not to get ahead of myself, but this is something that is going to be called into question, the election of Donald Trump. Japan's relationship with China is perhaps its second most important relation. To use a somewhat dated Chinese characterization. Economic relationship is hot. Japan and China have a very strong trade and investment relationship. China is Japan's #1 trade partner. But political relations are not as close, somewhat antagonistic. The other element of Japan's international relations that I'd like to cover, because I'm at the bottom of the slide, is Japan's relationship with North Korea, which is not good. Japanese public are frightened by North Korea, and perhaps they have good reason to be. North Korea has launched missiles over Japanese territory. So just think for a moment. If you lived in Japan and North Korea launched a missile over Japan, how would you feel? And that's a pretty good approximation to how many in the Japanese public feel about North Korea. So let me turn to the final of our background slides and talk about Japanese party politics. Japan is a bicameral parliamentary democracy, which means there's no president. The leader of Japan is a prime minister, with a very powerful, advanced industrialized economy, the third largest economy in the world. The prime minister of Japan is Shinzo Abe. He's been the prime minister since 2012, and he represents the Liberal Democratic Party. That's a party I'll talk a little bit more about for a moment. Despite the name, it's actually a conservative party. The joke about the LDP is the old quip that Voltaire made about the Holy Roman Empire. Not holy, not Roman, not an empire. Liberal Democratic Party. Not liberal, not so democratic. It's more of a party now, but it used to be a collection of factions. Despite that, I will be so bold as to say, my judgment, the Liberal Democratic Party is the most successful political party. Certainly, it's the most successful political party in a democracy in the post-war world. Just to illustrate that, the goal of a political party is to win power, and the LDP has been fabulously successful at that. Look at that. They were in power from the moment of their formation, well, a few months after, 1955, that's when the Liberal Party and the Democratic Party merged. The LDP then won that election in 1955 and won every election until 1993, when actually they still were the largest party, but they lost power to an opposition coalition for 14 months. And the LDP returned to power into 2009. And then that 2012 is when Abe led the LDP to victory in an election, and the LDP returned to power. But a quick calculation of 1955 to 2018 shows that the LDP has been in power about 94% of the time. That's astonishing. And remember, Japan is a parliamentary system, so there's not a divergence between the president and the legislature. They won the most recent election on October 22nd, and generally speaking, the LDP has been in favor of the US-Japan military alliance. Some in the LDP favor more investment in Japan's military potential. Since its creation, the LDP has also wanted to revise the Japanese constitution. So again, we see Article 9. That's going to be a point of focus for us. So with that as background, let's turn to how Trump matters for Japan. A lot. It's important to, whatever your feelings about President Trump are, the point that I want to make is that President Trump is very consequential for international relations. In this specific case, I'm going to talk about the US-Japan relationship and then also about domestic Japanese politics. But President Trump has mattered a lot. I'm going to try to explain how. And I'm going to start off with trade and security and then go into Japanese domestic politics. So those of you who have studied Japanese politics or Japanese history may remember, or perhaps just remember, the Nixon shocks of the 1970s. President Nixon abandoned the gold standard and normalized relations with the People's Republic of China without telling the Japanese. So the Japanese called the Nixon shocks. Today I'd like to coin a new term, the Trump shocks. The first one is more potential, but certainly it would be very consequential for Japan if a trade war between the United States and China were to break out. Japan is dependent upon international trade, and this could have substantial adverse effects on the Japanese economy and the well-being of many Japanese people. So this is more of a potential. But the second, withdrawal from the TPP negotiations, I'll explain in a moment. That's happened. And the third, as you know, has also happened. So what is the TPP? It's the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It's essentially a regional free trade agreement among initially 12 countries that was being negotiated. The conception behind the TPP was that it would help for the US to set the trade rules in Asia, which would preserve US influence. So this was setting the trade architecture for a broader region on terms that the US could help negotiate. Implicitly, it's aimed against rising Chinese economic power, although nobody will go on the record to say it. That's quite clear. It's let's set the rules before China is able to change them too much. Let's preserve our influence that way. For Japan, another benefit of the TPP negotiations was keeping the US engaged in Asia. Japan relies on the US nuclear umbrella, relies on US security guarantees. So a potential risk for Japan, when we talk about security, is that the US will withdraw from Asia. So the TPP framework for Japan also had the benefit of making sure the US was engaged in Asia. Unfortunately for Japan, and that's how it was viewed, Trump almost immediately withdrew from the TPP negotiations. However, Japan led the remaining 11 TPP negotiating countries, and you can see the list there, to a successful resolution. So the TPP agreement has been signed. This is a significant achievement for Japanese economic diplomacy. The hope in Tokyo is that the US administration at a future point may decide to join the TPP framework. So, jokes about Ocean's 11, then you get Ocean's 12, Ocean's 13. So the hope is that you'll have TPP 11, the US will then join, that'll be TPP 12, and maybe other countries will join. It could be a successful franchise. So let's talk a little bit more about trade. Here I'll focus on the steel and aluminum tariffs that were levied on imports to the US. Japan exports these to the US. However, Japan was not included on the list of allies that would be exempted. Why? This is an important question for Japanese diplomats and for the Japanese government. Perhaps it's because of President Trump's view on Japan, that Japan has been unfairly exploiting the US. Perhaps it's because it's an attempt to retain negotiating leverage in Japan in some kind of a bilateral negotiation. Generally speaking, Japan is trying to avoid bilateral negotiations with the US because the US has more leverage and security and wants to be involved in multinational trade agreements with the US instead. And this came rather painfully for Prime Minister Abe. Again, Prime Minister Abe led the LDP back to power in 2012, and he's been firmly in power ever since. He had assiduously courted Donald Trump, and I'll talk about that. Gulf diplomacy. Did it fail? But first, let's turn to security. And I'll just talk about this in two major points. The first one is the US-Japan Security Treaty. This is the cornerstone of Japan's security architecture in Asia, is their defense guarantee from the United States. Second will be a little bit more detail on North Korea. And this, I think, is in one slide. This map from the New York Times does a pretty good job of showing the basis for Japanese strategic thinking. You can see here different countries and how they're aligning. And if you've ever taken one class on international relations, I will guarantee you've heard the phrase balancing or bandwagoning. That's international relations 101. So what we can see here is some states are reacting to the rise of China by shifting into China's orbit more. Others are trying to balance against China, against the rise of Chinese influence. In Japan, deep blue, coded by the New York Times experts. I think it was Jenny Lind of Dartmouth who made this coding for Japan, but this is generally agreed upon. So you can see India, Australia, and Japan, to a lesser extent, Korea, trying to balance against Chinese influence. So for Japan, it's essential that the US remains engaged in Asia in order to accomplish this strategic goal. What would you do if you were the Prime Minister of Japan and US security guarantee weakened? And once Donald Trump became a major party nominee, Japanese security planners had to discount the guarantee of security provided by the United States. It becomes less reliable. If you're a security planner, you have to guarantee the security for your nation, for Japan. And if you can't count on the US, what will you do in response? That is the question facing Japan. And that is how Trump has changed Japanese security policy. And that is how Trump will affect the international relations of Asia through Japan. It's quite significant. We'll come back to some of the particulars of that later. Okay. I should ask Professor Sorensen or Professor Montgomery, but can a North Korean missile hit us here in Seattle? Maybe. It can definitely hit Tokyo. In fact, we know that because missiles have flown over Japan. So Japanese have to view potential North Korean nuclear threat as perhaps an existential threat to Japan. So Prime Minister Abe has been fully on board with the Trump administration's strategy of maximum pressure. Abe first rose to national prominence as a politician through antagonism towards North Korea, primarily at the time through an issue relating to Japanese who were abducted, Japanese citizens who were abducted by North Korea. But the Abe administration has been on board with this, supports the maximum pressure policy, but is worried that the Trump administration will act unilaterally in some way, whether that's a military strike on North Korea or whether that's some negotiations in the summit, and Tokyo will be left out. So with this background and the changes in security atmosphere, Article 9 comes into focus again. The LDP has supported changing Article 9. Younger Japanese increasingly feel that Article 9 was written at a time that had different security realities. The world has changed. Japan can't necessarily rely on the United States forever, and North Korea is a threat, and perhaps China will be more influential. So maybe Japan needs to take its security policy into its own hands by changing Article 9 and by developing its military more. That's the gist of it. Now let's turn to how this refracts through Japanese domestic politics. And I'll talk a little bit about the 2017 election. Japanese elections are a lot of fun for me. If you've ever been to Japan during the election period, it's frenzied. There's a lot going on. There's a very brief official campaign period, and it could be transfixing. In this election, on October 22nd, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, his LDP, pretty good results. Remember, the LDP is about winning, and they win big. Here it is. And this is their alliance partner, the Kome. They won a substantial majority, with 2/3. That's relevant because a 2/3 majority is required to revise the Japanese constitution. The leading opposition party is this party, the CDPJ, the Constitutional Democratic Party, Rikken Mishito. It did not exist in September 2017. The Party of Hope formed in September 2017. Japan's opposition parties are a mess. The LDP has the upper hand. I would say that for our purposes, we can understand the appeal of the CDPJ, a liberal party. Their motto might be protect Article 9. That's in the name, Constitutional Democratic Party. What they're signaling to voters is we want to preserve the Constitution. We do not want to change Article 9. Okay. So, I mentioned that Prime Minister Abe positioned himself in the election as somebody who could manage the relationship with Trump. He invested heavily in developing this reputation. The implicit premise is that Abe is a safe pair of hands. Trump could be disruptive. Who do you trust to manage the vital security and trade relationship with the United States? You should trust the LDP. Trust Abe. He's the first foreign leader to meet Trump. He presented him with a golden golf club. Did anybody hear that? I actually thought at the time it was like made of solid gold, but that's not true. It's just kind of gold. It is a very nice club. I'll show you a picture later. And then in November 2017, he was successful in having President Trump visit Japan. And at that time, President Trump did some things that Prime Minister Abe wanted him to do, like meeting families of some of the abductees from North Korea, the family members. And so this was generally seen as a success. Although, I will show you some video of that visit that may cause you to reconsider that. At least until Japan was not exempted from the steel and aluminum tariffs, you could make a pretty good case that Shinzo Abe had done the best job in any major US ally in managing the relationship with President Trump. Again, that's one of the things that Abe is, one of the appeals that he made in his election campaign. You compare the relationship that President Trump had with Shinzo Abe to the relationship that President Trump has with Angela Merkel of Germany or Theresa May of the UK. It's a very different relationship. They seem to be friendly. People even evoked comparisons to the famous relationship that President Reagan had with then Japanese Prime Minister Nakasone, the Ron Yasu, first name relationship. And a lot of Abe's appeal, I'm just going to use this as a metaphor, but let's see how this plays out. Golf. There's that club. That's a nice club. I don't even play golf, but I like that club a lot. So now I'm going to try something technologically dangerous. I'm going to exit my PowerPoint. As a political scientist, I feel very comfortable in PowerPoint. I'm going to exit, and I'm going to try to show you a video. If it fails, I have a backup. Let's see. Okay. Here's the video. Yes, it seems to be working. This is great. So this is the Japanese Prime Minister. Takes a tumble. What could that mean? Let's see. Here he is, Shinzo Abe. There's Donald Trump. They're golfing. And then the Japanese TV companies sent drones to film them as they golf. So Prime Minister Abe has landed here in this bunker. He's going to take a shot to get out. Good shot. He's out. Oop, that was a practice. Okay, now he's out. Good job. Somebody comes to rake. Everything seems to be going well. Golf diplomacy is working. Get out of the bunker. Oh no. Okay. That's bad. If you're the Japanese Prime Minister and you fall like that, and there's a drone watching, that's bad. I think it gets worse. Watch President Trump's reaction. What do you think he's going to do? That's cold. Let's see. He is. Didn't even notice. So, is Gulf diplomacy working? In the context of Japan's failure to secure exemption from the steel and aluminum tariffs, people begin to wonder if this is maybe not a better depiction of the relationship than it first appeared. Okay, back to the safety zone of PowerPoint. So that's that video. Here it is. Oh man. Japanese TV can be tough on politicians. So now let's turn to one more aspect of Japanese domestic politics. And here I just want to explore Japanese public's views of the United States. Okay. Now, this is from 2011, but take a look at this. You notice, and it's opinions of the United States. You have a favorable, unfavorable view of the US, and here's a list of countries, okay? And here's their, what's happening? Oh, what's going on? Okay, so, wait till week 9, yeah, okay. So here's the percent of people who have a favorable view of the US. What do you see there? It's really quite remarkable. Yes, Japanese like Americans more than Americans like America. It's stunning. It's true. Look at that. Japanese love America. Second is Kenya. This might be attributed to President Obama, but then the United States, France. Thank you, France. And then things start to get worse down here. Okay, so remember that. And generally, Japanese public, there's almost 130 million people in Japan, so I certainly can't speak for all of them. But generally speaking, the Japanese public has had a very favorable impression of the United States. It's gotten even better, and Japanese public opinion about the US-Japan alliance has improved significantly in the 21st century. So, as a generalization, I can say Japanese like America. They want to have a strong military relationship, a strong economic relationship, a strong cultural relationship with the United States, which is why they want the US to stay in Asia. Around the world, we see in the Pew surveys a change in views of the US over this period, which encompasses the election of President Trump. So I put up the whole world, but we're really only interested in this part now. It went down, okay? It went down a lot of places. It went up in Russia. I don't know why, but it went down in Japan. Another question on this survey asked Japanese how confident they are in the US president, ability to make decisions. And remember that if you feel more confident in the US president, since the US is providing a security guarantee for you, you will feel more confident in the US-Japan alliance and more confident about your own security in Japan. Okay. So it dropped precipitously with the election of President Trump. What we should be thinking now is not, that means President Trump is bad. What you should think is, how will that change the calculations of Japanese security planners? How will that change public support in Japan for increasing the power of Japanese military? And how will that change the international relations of Asia? And that's what I mean to say, that this is a consequential event for the international relations of the world. Okay, So, we're at the halfway point. But I'll make the second half quick. One thing that we talked about earlier was how the LDP won this election big. It's been given a mandate to govern. The leading opposition party is the Protect Article 9 party. I showed you the third party, but I didn't really talk about it much except to say it was a new party. This party is called HOPE. It was formed by Tokyo Governor Yuriko Koike, who led a party called Tominfasto, the Tokyoites First. Does that sound familiar? Right? Flash Party led it to victory in the Tokyo Metropolitan Assembly. Tokyo is a huge area. It's the equivalent of a state, a big one. And she routed the LDP in that election. So, what does that mean for the future of Japanese politics? I painted a picture of stability, but it's also possible to see seeds of instability in this change in parties. So, let's talk a little bit about democracy. What is democracy? How do you define democracy? That's a question I asked my class earlier today with the pop quiz. I won't do that now, but think about it a little bit. Just come up with your own answer for that. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about democracy, because what's at stake here is Japan has had a very strong and stable democracy for the entire post-war period. Will that continue in the future? Here I just want to talk a little bit about democracy. However we define it. Generally, political scientists have a definition that centers around free and fair elections, political contestation. It's generally accepted that democracy has spread in the 20th century. I think many of us here will remember the end of history. It really wasn't that long ago, but that democracy emerged, capitalist democracy emerged as the model. Fewer people think that today. One of the questions people who study democracy ask, is there a threat to democracy around the world? Autocracy is the familiar form. Tanks roll out of the barracks, military takes over the government. It's a classic form. But a newer one is democratic erosion through the forces of populism. So I'm just going to go through this a little bit quickly. For our purposes, what's happening in democracy and how does that change our evaluation of the future of Japanese democracy? There's three broadly used measures of democracy to compare democracy in one country with another country, or to compare democracy's change over time. One is set up by a team of scholars. Originally, Ted Gurr, University of Maryland. There's a Polity 5 being developed, but these are the Polity 4 measures. Second is from an NGO, Freedom House, a think tank located in New York and Washington, D.C., that publishes measures of freedom. Not exactly democracy, but it corresponds to a lot of the elements of democracy that we're interested in. And the third is the Economist Intelligence Unit. This is the consulting part of The Economist magazine, a London, UK-based publication. So here's the trend, according to Polity, in democracies around the world. You can see there's not a lot of democracies, and then democracies greatly increase. What you should take away from this is the rise of democracies in the 20th century, the spread of democracy, according to the Polity measures. We also see, according to the Freedom House measures, not exactly the same, but it's the same story. And that gives us confidence when a different set of measures trying to capture the same thing, because we don't have a perfect measure of democracy, shows the number of countries, the percent of people around the world who live in a democracy increased in the 20th century. Another way to characterize the Freedom House results will be to characterize countries as free partly free or not free. So you can see this is the free world. This is partly free and not free. Venezuela is the part of South America that experienced change in regime through a populist leader, Hugo Chavez. Another way to look at this, Freedom House measures, free and partly free, it's a lot of countries, not free 25%. A little disproportionate from population because of China. Right? China and India have such large populations that they materially affect this result more than any other states. So what I'd like you to take away from that is just that in the 20th century, there was generally a spread of democracy around the world. Bad news. The recent trend is down. It's the other way. Take a look at the Freedom House data. These are the number of countries that decline in their freedom score. Higher score is more free, more democratic. Lower score is less. Fewer countries are improving. A lot more countries are going down. Here's another way to look at that data that I found so fascinating I couldn't resist. But it's a little hard to get into this. You might get hypnotized. But here you can see these are the longer these are, the more democratic the states are. Okay? So these are less democratic countries, these are more democratic countries, and they're arranged from the least free, to be more accurate, to the most free. These are the most free states. And then these are the state, this Colombia is the only one that significantly became more free. But you can see several states become much less free. I want to call your attention to Poland, long considered the best hope for consolidated democracy in Eastern Europe, if not already a consolidated democracy, the Philippines, and Turkey. What they have in common, populism. So what's happening to these democracies? The rise of populism is something that's been identified. The question that we have, for our purposes, hanging in the back of our heads is, was this something that could happen in Japan as well? Here's a definition of populism. I won't read it, but take a look at it. It's from a Dutch scholar, Kasmuda. We could spend a lot of time talking about what populism is or isn't, but I'll put this up as a tatakidai, a chance for us to, a basis for discussion. Wrote it in 2004. So again, it's not directed at any particular American politician necessarily. Okay. Liberal democracies, democracies with the free and fair elections, and also these institutions that sustain democracy, and also a set of norms, democratic norms in liberal democracies. Populism can be democratic, but illiberal. Here's an example to make my point. Liberal democracy means protection of rights, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech. In the Swiss Constitution, up until 2009, read freedom of religion and conscience is guaranteed. In 2009, 58% of Swiss voted to change it. Here's how it reads now. That is a democratic result. People voted to do that. Is it consistent with democracy? Yes. Is it consistent with liberal democracy? That is open to question. Afraid time for democracy is over. It's chilling. I also think that People in this area especially would be familiar with the sad history of the internment of Japanese Americans, which was popular in the American public. That's a parallel to that. Populist playbook, institutions undermine judicial independence, as Viktor Orban in Hungary, right? Because courts should not be allowed to thwart the will of the public. If courts said people had the right to build minarets, that would be thwarting the will of the public. Muzzle the press. Vladimiro Montesinos in Peru worked for Alberto Fujimori, was a master at controlling the press through threats, through blackmail, through bribery, and also subverting democratic norms. One in particular I want to call your attention to, but the norm of treating political adversaries as adversaries, not as enemies. And the difference is that with adversaries, you might win an election, you treat your adversary with respect, because next time they may win and you'll expect the same thing. You respect the results of the election. Populism can undermine this norm by treating adversaries as enemies. I'm going to come back to that later. But first, I want to show you the trajectory that Freedom House has plotted for the United States. Okay? Declining. You can agree with that or disagree with it, but that's one of the three big measures of the strength of democracy. By the way, Japan does pretty well on that score. Both are free. Japan's a little bit more free. 96, 86. Let me turn to a different measure of democracy. Rather than being fixated on these individual measures, look at the trend. And this is from the Economist Intelligence Unit, which often says that they're distinguished by having a thicker description, having a more nuanced understanding of the politics of a country. Here's the 19 full democracies that they see. The US is not on the list. It's a flawed democracy, according to The Economist. The threats to American democracy that these organizations that evaluate democracy have identified: first, populism, identified more prominently by Freedom House. And the second, polarization, political polarization of the US. This is more prominently identified by the Economist Intelligence Unit. So I'm going to conclude by talking a little bit about polarization. But first, I want to talk about someone that you may not initially think of as a threat to democracy: Franklin Roosevelt. Here's the case we could make about Franklin Roosevelt. He interned Japanese Americans, packed the Supreme Court. The size of the Supreme Court is not set by the US Constitution. Between 1800 and 1870, it changed many times for political purposes. Roosevelt proposed to add 6 new justices to the Supreme Court, changing its balance. This sounds like a populist move. It sounds a lot like what Viktor Orban did in Hungary. It sounds a lot like what the Law and Justice Party is attempting in Poland. He also violated a strong democratic norm in the United States of 2 terms in office for the president. That was not a written rule, it was a strongly held norm. Of course, the US Constitution was revised after this norm violation. It was a huge expansion of executive orders under Franklin Roosevelt. So, was Franklin Roosevelt a populist who could have subverted American democracy but failed? If he were around today, would he succeed? The climate in the United States has certainly changed since Franklin Roosevelt was president. And here's some of the elements that I want to bring out. The first is residential partisan segregation. Then I'm going to touch a little bit on media transformation. I'm not going to have time to talk about the rise of outside money or contestation over voter rules, delegitimation of results, or really about presidentialization. But I will come back to polarization. So we'll be able to look at some of these elements. I'm not going to try to sing. You'll all be happy. But we're living in a landslide. What I mean is, there are districts in the United States, places where the presidential vote is fairly evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. And there are districts where the vote is heavily skewed towards one party or another in a landslide. The districts where results are heavily skewed have been increasing dramatically in the United States. In Seattle, for example, Donald Trump received 8% of the presidential vote. That was third among American cities, third lowest. Washington, D.C. and Detroit were lower. I looked at the precinct level data to see how people voted in Seattle. And I noticed that Wallingford, I don't know if any of you live in Wallingford, but if you do, I know that you did not vote for Donald Trump. Because Donald Trump received 0 votes in the Wallingford precinct. I didn't realize that would evoke Wallingford pride. That is amazing. And if we look at the US population, it is now residentially segregating, so that many people live in landslide counties, the 3,000 counties in the US. Not precincts, not Wallingford, but counties. Huge numbers of people live in areas where they have similar political views. So we imagine before this intense residential segregation, you might support one political party, but you knew your neighbor supported a different one, and she was okay. So even if you disagreed with her political party, she was a good person. But now, you may not know anybody in your neighborhood who supports a different political party. In many, many counties in the United States, that can change how we view others, how we view people who support another political party. And I'm going to come back to that. But first, I want to show it to you graphically. From 1992, here we have the landslide districts. The color becomes more intense, the bigger landslide. But even 20 is a landslide. Up to much bluer districts. Look at the change over time. That's striking. 1992. You were unlikely to live in a landslide district, but 2016 probably did. If we look at that, just those 2 years, these look like very different maps. And look at Washington, right? Look at the difference, even in our own state. The intense blue of King County and the intense red of Eastern Washington. That was something that was quite different in 1992. That is residential segregation by partisan affiliation, spatial autocorrelation. It's paralleled by polarization in media. And I know we'll have a speaker later in the quarter that will address this. So I'm just going to talk about it briefly. Okay. The reliance on individuated media sources, Facebook, and partisan cable networks. This is different from the days in which there were a limited number of major media sources that were shared by large numbers of people. Now, the information that you get is different depending on who you are and what you watch. I have a great illustration of this. Should I be alarmed at that? Are you telling me my time's up? Okay, all right. So I want to show you an illustration from the New York Times that I found right before I had to give a talk in Italy about American party polarization. And do you remember about that time, Paul Manafort, former campaign chair for the Trump campaign, was indicted. That's when it was covered. Now what this shows is 3 major cable news networks and what coverage they had from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. on that day. And each of these is a 1-minute block. Okay? So MSNBC, all 60 minutes were spent covering the Manafort indictment. Every second they were covering the Manafort indictment. CNN, that's all they talked about, but they took a commercial break. Fox News covered the Manafort indictment as a leading story, then went to the dossier, back to Manafort indictment, commercials, Halloween costume, American patriotism, cheeseburger emojis, commercial, out. So if you, at 8:41, if you were watching these different news networks, here's what you would see. MSNBC, Manafort surrenders to FBI. CNN, Paul Manafort gets indicted in Mueller probe. Fox, emoji cheeseburgers. So, I think emoji cheeseburgers are great. And I know you can't eat them, but what you should take away from this, it's not Fox News is bad, but rather that you can have people just have different information. And that can contribute to our differing views of each other. And this is really perhaps the greatest threat when we start to think about political adversaries as enemies. So here's my last graphic. And it's a sobering one. And I hope that in our discussion today of how great an impact President Trump has on Japan's international relations and domestic politics, and this latter aspect, that you should not take away just that whatever political party you don't like is wrong. That can be quite dangerous. And here's what we see. In recent years, an increasing number of partisans who see the opposite political party not just as political adversaries, but as a threat to the well-being of the country. This is a danger factor for American democracy, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit. Okay, so the big question for the future is, where will democracy go? What will happen with Japanese democracy? What will happen with American democracy? What will happen with democracies around the world? I'd like to ask you now 2 questions. After each one, I'll ask you to raise your hand. There's not a right answer. First, I'm going to ask you, how optimistic are you about the future of Japanese democracy? Raise your hand if you're more optimistic than pessimistic. Yay, Japan. Good. Okay. So now let me ask you, how optimistic are you about American democracy? Raise your hand if you're more optimistic than pessimistic. Great. I guess we will find out. And with that, I'd like to end my remarks, and I will welcome your questions and discussion. Oh, sure.
Can you just repeat the question?
Okay, thanks. Okay, yes? So the question is, what was the main themes of the Tokyoites First party that led them to such success? Well, one of the popular themes was the governor of Tokyo, Koike, and the relocation of the fish market, Tsukiji, and its contamination. So she was beating up on bureaucrats and raising local issues. I think that the other main theme is the unpopularity of the LDP that made it possible for this party to rise. And broadly speaking, this is what we see in democracies around the world. Right? There's incumbent political parties that have soft support. So even if the appeal is not so great, since Tokyoites First, I'm not sure, if it's really such a winning platform, they can enjoy a lot of success. We see that also, for example, in the recent Italian elections.
Had a lost decade. How's their economy doing today?
Yeah. So the question is, Japan had a lost decade with their economy. How's their economy doing today? Japanese economy has recovered. Japanese economy is growing and has enjoyed more robust growth recently. Oh, sorry. That's over here. Yeah. So the question is about the recent scandals, kind of twin Gakuen scandals in Japanese politics, and how serious a threat is that to Japanese democracy. So there's a kind of complicated scandal involving a school who was sold public land at a heavily discounted price, about 85%. And the ostensible reason is that it may have been contaminated. But it looked like it was a sweetheart land deal for a school who had close connections to Prime Minister Abe and his wife Akie. So this scandal broke earlier in the year, and it looked like it might devastate Prime Minister Abe, and he might have to resign. He survived that scandal, but recently it's come out that the Ministry of Finance officials who had kind of hidden the discussion about the involvement of Prime Minister Abe. And I should say that this is kind of a scandal in which it's not necessarily alleged that Prime Minister Abe told people what to do, but rather that bureaucrats anticipated what would be pleasing to the Prime Minister. So think about that when you think about kind of keeping business dealings out of politics. It's not that there was a direction to sell this, but rather that this is something we know that the Prime Minister will like. It's a nationalist school. So that now that this kind of potentially deliberate omission of information has resurfaced, Prime Minister Abe's support has diminished. He's been remarkably popular for the last several years. So the bigger question, so there's two questions. First is, will Prime Minister Abe survive? And I think that's kind of political horse race. If you think about Prime Minister Abe, he's been Prime Minister since 2012, but before that, Japan went through a succession of prime ministers. Went through about 8 prime ministers in as many years. It didn't seem like anyone could sustain support. Prime Minister Abe did maintain good levels of public support, dipped down a couple times when he passed new security legislation, then began to dip earlier in this year. He may survive, he may not, depends what comes out. The bigger question is, what does that show about Japanese democracy? And I think what it shows is 2 things. First, that the free press in Japan is prepared to go after politicians. They are prepared to talk about scandals that can damage politicians. So if we think about press freedom, which is under attack in many places around the world, and which the LDP and Prime Minister Abe have been accused of trying to curtail in various ways, we can still see that the press is able to generate scandals that can have political repercussions. I think that's that's the big picture with this scandal. Yeah. Yeah.
The LDP,
Yes.
I guess my question is
Yes, you know, and the question is looking at the changes in Japanese public perception and favorability of U.S. presidents in the U.S. Is the LDP's brand of conservatism like that of the GOP's brand of conservatism? I would say that, broadly speaking, the LDP conceives itself as a conservative party, even though it didn't really label itself that until fairly recently. And they have felt themselves more in sympathy with the Republican Party historically. So Japanese with a rooting interest in US elections have rooted for Republicans, even if officially they will not take a position. And the reason is that they felt that Democrats were more likely to be protectionist, and that protectionism could hurt the Japanese economy, particularly when Japan was more dependent upon the US economically. I think that they also felt some kind of a kinship with Republicans as conservative and as favoring stronger military. The US government doesn't have a proposal for Japan's revision of its constitution, but the US government would like Japan to revise its constitution. They would like Japan to be able to contribute militarily more to US-Japan security alliance. So that's probably a fair characterization, although the LDP is a pretty heterogeneous party. And now I think they are rethinking their feelings about American political parties. Sure, I think so. Well, I might get dizzy though. Wow, a lot has happened. God, we're only now just getting out of democracy. Okay. Oh, still bad. Still looks bad. This one. Yeah.
so when you look at the quantitative as colonization that happened over the 200 years here in the West, Western Europe, the United States, now being realigned to the colonization of China. Demonstrate that those countries are now looking as capitalism moves to
Okay, so there's a question about the hollowing out of industrial production in Western Europe, United States, and Japan, shifting to China. I think what I would say about that is what this is showing is the response of shared expectations that China's economy will get larger. But what will countries do in response to that? Should they try to snuggle up to China and form a closer relationship with China? Or are they concerned about China becoming too powerful and they want to balance against it? So this is not really investigating the shift in production, but it's rather premised on these shared expectations for shift in power in the future.
Robert, for a wonderful lecture. Next.